Well, the Electoral Commission has now hosted a dialogue to raise awareness on artificial intelligence and social media bots ahead of next year's election. Here in South Africa, that is. The aim was to educate the public on the opportunities and the challenges of social media and technology during election season. Now, the Institute for Security Studies also held a seminar on the impact of digital influence on Africa's elections, looking at past elections in Kenya and Nigeria as well. So let's get one of their experts to weigh in on this issue. We're joined this morning by Karen Allen, who is an independent consultant on emerging threats and digital diplomacy with the ISS. Karen, it's great to talk to you. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. It's very interesting, this issue, as we go into elections once again here in South Africa. The build-up is now, the road to 2024. The issue around misinformation, and as we try to get a handle on it, the issues around censorship.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, misinformation and disinformation. And disinformation is really more the intentional distorting of narratives. It's as old as the hills. But what we're seeing is with the use of artificial technology and so many more of us on social media, it's being amplified at scale. And so what we're seeing is a couple of things. We're seeing disinformation in terms of actual distortions. People will have seen things like deep fakes or misplacement of video that maybe was taken from years back. We saw that in the Kenyan election of a speech by former President Barack Obama seemingly supporting one particular candidate. Was completely taken out of context. It was years old. It was nothing to do with the Kenyan election that we were researching last year. Right through to influence operations. And what that means is people who are massively influential on social media platforms, able to build and to utilize their network and use it in a coordinated, inauthentic way. And what that means is giving you the impression that you're talking to lots of like-minded people with shared views on social media, where in fact it might actually be a bot or some kind of other inauthentic coordinated activity, which gives you the sense that your view is shared by a large number of people. And we've seen that being used in the past to try and inflame tensions on touchstone issues, divisive issues, which come to the fore during elections.
And you saw this particularly, I'm just looking at the information in front of me here, on the work that the ISS and other institutions are doing. But if we look at how this is playing out on the continent, in Kenya in particular, this issue of influences and how they were used in the elections last year.
Yeah, and we studied the Kenyan elections really, really closely. And we saw very, very interesting use of influencers. Some were political influencers. They were known, established people within the political sort of domain. But we also saw this really, really interesting phenomenon of product influencers. And these are people who, for much of the year, would spend their time supporting products, whether it's makeup, sports shoes, or whatever. They would then sell their influence to political parties in order to amplify their reach. And the kinds of money that was exchanging hands was quite extraordinary, and thousands of US dollars to generate a hashtag. I was just doing the conversion, I think 135,000 Rand just to be able to set up a hashtag on behalf of a political party. And these are very, very sophisticated actors that take their established networks, their established influence, and pivot it towards politics. And it may well be that if you're following one of these people, you may not even know that you're being used in this way. And this is why it's become such a big area of study. And what we saw in Kenya is that touchstone issues like mistrust of the state, mistrust of mainstream media, of legacy media, a deep state narratives, the kind of language that we've seen in other settings, including the United States, these were being used to try and whip up tensions. The good news is that there were some good fact-checking organizations in Kenya. We also have them here in South Africa that in some cases were able to amplify and flag up these kind of very crude distortions. The problem with influence and networks is it's happening so fast. And we now have more and more types of AI tools which are able to speed up the way information is sent to us, even though the information may be sent in a coordinated way, and it may not be a genuine person's view. This is not about stifling free speech. This is about how information is transmitted to us, how we receive it, as opposed to what's being said.
Well, that's where the difficulty comes in, right, Karen, I imagine, in trying to get a handle on an issue like this, because as you say, it is just so prolific. It's difficult to even keep a handle on what's misinformation, what's disinformation, and even which mainstream media I can trust just as a consumer of media. It's difficult for people to know who to trust.
It is difficult. And, you know, I'm a former journalist by background, and I would always advocate that people look to as many different sources as possible for a news story. But the reality is that we're busy people, and we rely on our trusted news sources. I think legacy media, so mainstream media like yourselves, play an absolute vital role in helping to debunk some of the misinformation that is distorted, but also by not inadvertently helping to amplify some influence narratives. So simply by, for example, putting out a hashtag or retweeting something as a media organization, you might be inadvertently amplifying it and giving it the oxygen of publicity, we used to call it. But also understanding, and we saw this in Kenya to a limited extent, that if you are a legacy journalist, if you have the responsibility of working in a newsroom and trying to use double sourcing and all the techniques that we get taught in a journalism school, you can't in the evening pivot and become an influencer and use that to make vast amounts of money. Now, I think it's a very different setting in South Africa because we do have a very, very strong history of robust journalism. And we also have, I think, horror. I've tested this among sort of the journalist fraternity about the thought of possibly moonlighting in the evenings and becoming an influencer. But nevertheless, I think the general public also needs to know that there are certain things that they might see as fishy activity on social media platforms. For example, if someone says, follow me and I'll follow you, and it's someone who comes completely out of the blue, I would be slightly suspicious of that, because that sounds like someone's trying to build a network, trying to build something called a follow train in order to then utilize that as a vehicle to push a particular narrative. I think there are some tools that are being developed to try and some AI tools that are being developed to try and weed out artificially amplified narrative. The difficulty is we're all human beings, and the human social engineering part is really, really central to this. So I think, you know, the key thing is just, if possible, as you approach the elections, as an ordinary member of the public, and you're using social media, just be a little bit aware. If you happen to be following a group that, for example, is promoting a particular sports group or a particular item of clothing, and then a few months down the line, you see it pivot and other messages start coming in, I would seriously be questioning whether me as a follower has effectively been sold to an influencer and I become part of a network. I become one of these unwitting foot soldiers in helping to propel narratives. But I think really the ultimate protection is to be really, really vigilant and try and get your news sources from as wide a range of outlets as possible. Yeah,
absolutely. That's great advice, but we know how sophisticated these networks are, right? Even when we talk about people who hack into our bank accounts, for example, these hackers are extremely clever in the methods that they use to try and latch onto someone. You know, oftentimes it'll be some or other, trying to make some or other emotional connection. And one would imagine in a context like South Africa, with our history of, for example, corruption and various other touchstone issues around service delivery, that might be one way of latching on to an account that is not trustworthy, but because they use these touchstone issues.
100%. I mean, look, just a couple of weeks ago, we had the taxi strikes and we had the violence in Cape Town. For me, as an outsider looking in, you know, if you were wanting to stir up trouble online and you were wanting to use an issue such as that to be able to amplify a particular narrative, there is the perfect opportunity. And I'm not giving any intelligence away by saying that. We do have touchstone issues in South Africa, and I think we need to be really, really aware of how those can be used. I think it's difficult because we've now got we're in an era where speed is king, so the actual volume of material that is being thrown at us is massive, and it's very, very difficult for our more traditional media outlets to be able to keep up with that, whether it's TV, whether it's community radio, whether it's newspapers. But I think we just have to be really vigilant. There are great fact-checking organizations like Code for Africa, that's operating Africa Check, that's operating in this part of the world, that will do its best to try and flag up content. It's music to my ears that the Electoral Commission are really taking this seriously and trying to look at public awareness events. My feeling is that they need to be speaking not simply to other think tanks or civil society organizations, or they play an extraordinarily important role. But we need to be able to be seeing more public information campaigns that are aimed at ordinary people like you and me, or that are aimed at our parents or the younger generation. I mean, I'm trying to hang out with as many teenagers as possible to understand how they use social media, because, for an older generation, for those of us that weren't brought up with that as part of our mainstay access to news, one has to understand how effectively the electorate can be hacked. And as you say, South Africa is very much a target for cyber attacks. This is no different. This is seen as a content-related offense. In Kenya, we saw that it was domestically generated, so a lot of the influence operations were indigenous. They were created by other Kenyans who were very, very technically savvy. There is no reason why we can't see those same techniques either being exported to countries like South Africa for our elections, for those individuals, other proxies being used, or external players also wading in and using the vulnerabilities in our information environment here in South Africa to help stir up tensions for some political ends.
Yeah. I mean, fact-checking organizations will have their hands full going into the elections, just talking from a South African perspective for 2024. Yeah. And obviously we need AI to come in and take a part of that burden, right? I just want to round off our conversation, Karen. When we talk about, the IEC taking this issue seriously, what would be the role of political parties here also doing their part and ensuring the credibility of our election next year?
It's a good question. And I think, different political parties may take a different position on it. I think, first of all, information and knowledge about what is actually happening, because it's going to be used, some may be using it in their favor, but it may also be used against them. So I think we need a very open, honest public conversation with political parties. I think we need to remind ourselves that South Africa has a strong history of democracy, and that our pillars of democracy, which including the media, need to be supported and need to be trumpeted, and therefore, using inauthentic means to try and win votes. Not saying it's not going to happen, but it needs to be something that needs to be called out very, very strongly. Absolutely.
Karen Allen, let me thank you for your time this morning. Thanks for weighing in on an incredibly important discussion as we get on the road to elections 2024.